Now, before continuing to learn JavaScript in this new section, we should first activate a special mode in JavaScript called strict mode. And here on my desktop, I already have the folder for this Part 2 Fundamentals section. And for you, as I explained before, these starter files will come from the GitHub repository that I showed you at the beginning of the course. So use that GitHub repository as your starter folder, or of course you can just copy that data somewhere else to your computer and work from there. Whatever works for you. Now I'm creating here a new VS Code window. And let's open this new folder. So that's our new working folder. And this time we already have the script file here. And in the HTML file, we see that the script is also already linked. So we don't have to do that this time. At this point, I assume that you already know how to do that. So closing the sidebar here, and let's now get started in this new section. And as I said, let's start with strict mode. So strict mode is a special mode that we can activate in JavaScript, which makes it easier for us to write secure JavaScript code. And all we have to do to activate strict mode is to write this string at the beginning of the script. So use strict. And that's it. So with this, we activated strict mode for the entire script. Now what's important is that this line of code, so this statement here basically, has to be the very first statement in the script. So if we have any code before this, then strict mode will not be activated. Comments are allowed because JavaScript will just ignore them, but no code. Okay, now we actually can also activate strict mode only for a specific function or a specific block, but I don't really see the point in doing that. And so I always just use it at the beginning of each script. And so I believe that you should do the same. So always just put strict mode in the beginning of your scripts, and like that, write more secure code. And with secure, I mean that strict mode makes it easier for us developers to avoid accidental errors. So basically, it avoids us to introduce bugs into our code. And that's because of two reasons. First, strict mode forbids us to do certain things. And second, it will actually create visible errors for us in certain situations in which, without strict mode, JavaScript would simply fail silently without letting us know that we did a mistake. Okay? So again, first, strict mode forbids us to do certain things. And second, it creates visible errors in the developer console, where in other situations, JavaScript would just fail silently. Okay, but now to make this a bit more clear, let's actually see an example of one of the most important changes that strict mode introduces. So let's create a variable here with a complicated name. Let's say has driver's license. And let's initialize it to false here. And then I also will create pass test and set that to true. And I'm using let in both of them because I want to change them later. And actually this one not. So let's just use a const here. Because remember, by default, we should always use const to avoid accidental errors. So basically there is a certain person which right now does not have a driver's license, but they just passed a test. That's why we have pass test set to true. And now we want to write some logic so that when they pass the test, this variable here gets set to true. So we can say if pass test, right? Because this here is a Boolean value. And so this condition will be either true or false. And then let's introduce a simple bug here. Okay. So this is a kind of hard to write variable name. And so let's pretend that we are writing it wrong here. So has driver license equal to true. So what I did here was to basically omit the S. So this letter here is not in this variable that I'm trying to change here to true. And again, that is an error that I'm making here on purpose, just to show you how strict mode can help us avoid a certain kind of error. Because doing this is actually more common than you might think, okay? And now, then let's log something to the console if the person has a driver's license. And so now we're actually gonna go back to writing it correctly. So if has driver's license, and so you see that now this one is exactly the same, as VS Code highlights both. So if has driver's license, then log to the console, I can drive. And now let's actually start by deactivating strict mode again, just so we see how this bug could affect our code. So I'm giving it a save, and then let's go and open this index.html file. Okay, now let's open up the console here. And again, I'm going to increase the text by hitting Command plus a couple of times here. Okay, so let's reload here just to make sure that everything is working. And now what we see is that it didn't log I can drive to the console, even though we attempted to set has driver's license to true here. And so we expected that driver's license being true should then log I can drive. But it didn't work. And that's because of the mistake that I just introduced here on purpose for getting this S. So without the error, it should work, right? But without it, it's not gonna work. And again, because basically here I set a new variable to true and not the original one. So this one is still false, and that's why here this logging does not happen. So now our program has a bug, which means that it has a mistake, and we would now go ahead and find that bug. But strict mode can actually help us with this. So let's turn it back on, give it a save, and now try it again. And now we actually get an error. So here we see that has driver license is not defined. So in line number 6, which is right here. And so this error message now tells us exactly what is wrong. So it tells us that this variable is not defined. And then we can see, oh, we did a mistake here. We're missing the S, right? So now it's the same variable here, here, and here, okay? And so if we try that now again, then the error is gone. And so strict mode really helped us avoiding this kind of bug that we created here. And you can experiment a little bit with this to make it really clear. Now, another thing that strict mode does is to introduce a short list of variable names that are reserved for features that might be added to the language a bit later. For example, let's try to define a variable called interface. For example, for an audio interface. And now if we try this, then we see that we get an unexpected strict mode reserved word error message, basically. And that is, again, because JavaScript is reserving this word here for a feature that it might implement in the future. And so by reserving this kind of words, it will then make it easier to implement the feature in the future. So another one is private, for example. So const private, just some number here. And so this one will also not work. And that's because in the future, there might be something called private fields in classes or in some other places, even in the language. And they might want to use this word for that. And so strict mode reserves these words so that we cannot use them for variables. It's the same logic as this one. So we cannot call a variable if, right? And that's because there is already an if statement. So here we get unexpected token if. And so that's like the rules that I explained to you in the beginning about naming variables. Okay? All right. Now there are actually a lot of other changes that affect things that we haven't learned about yet. So that's stuff like functions, objects, setting properties on primitive values, and many more. And I will mention them in future lectures when the time comes. But everything that I'm gonna say in the rest of the course from now on will always assume that you have strict mode turned on. And so I will add this line of code here to all the scripts in the future, and so you should do the same. Anyway, with this out of the way, let's now start learning functions.